Hi, and welcome back to Glassboxed, writing automated RSpec tests. Today we're going to have a look at the concept of check-in to see if certain values are correct. We're effectively going to validate results in our test with some kind of checking mechanism to make sure that our actual values and expected values are the same, and we're going to look at how to do these checks. So this means we will actually look at two particular checking methods, the first being should and the second being expect. So today we're going to have a look at validation methods, why you would want to validate and how to validate. So let me explain what should and expect are first. So when you have a test, and at the moment we've got an empty test that doesn't do anything at all. When you have a test that does something, so let's just say our test method is some kind of really basic calculation where we add two numbers. So let's just say num1 is equal to 5 and num2 is equal to 10, and we have a total which is equal to num1 plus num2. We will want to check that the total is of an expected value. So if we added num1 and num2, we should get a total of 15. If we were to check to see if this 15 was indeed the actual value of total, how would we do that? Well, we would use these concept of using a should and expect. So if you're familiar with writing code in Java, then should and expect are the equivalent of writing an assert line of code, is to assert that something is either true or false. And we achieve the same behavior using a should and an expect. Let's have a quick look at should first. So let's just say, just so we can see some sort of value, I'm just going to run this really quickly. And we get a value of 15 back as part of this puts, which is as expected. But now let's try and use this should. So what we're going to say is total, and to use should is quite simply should. And then we can do some kind of equivalence testing. So in this case we want to use a double equal, and let's just say 15. If we run this now, so running this, it still printed out the 15. And it's also said that one example ran with a single path, but it's also printed out this deprecated warning. I'll get back to this deprecated warning in a bit, but note that as long as we're using the should, we will get this warning. So for the moment, let's just ignore this warning and carry on as if it wasn't there. But for those who aren't entirely sure what a warning is basically a message that's displayed to the user when you run something. So in this case we ran our test, just telling the user some additional information which didn't stop whatever it is that you were about to run from running, but it's just providing you some extra information. So like I said, we'll get back to this warning in a bit. But this should is effectively used to check or validate the actual value of something. So in this case, what we were checking was to see if the value of something was as we expected it to be, and in this case we use should. So what we were effectively saying was the title should be equal to 15. If we were to change this to say something like 16 and run this, we now get a failure. What we get is, again, ignoring the warning for the moment, what we're getting is saying we expected the value of something to be 16, but instead we got a 15 whilst using this equivalence operator. So what this is effectively telling us is that as part of one of the shoulds, we were expecting the value of that should to be 16, but instead in the code a 15 was returned. So this is basically telling us that something failed. If you click on this link, it tells you exactly where your failure happened. We can even go a little bit further. We can say, instead of just saying should, we can say something along the lines of should be, which is the same as saying should. Again, let's just run this. So again, we got a failure at the same line. So let me explain why we're using should here. So on this line, we're saying total dot should be equal to 16. We know the value isn't supposed to be 16, but let's just ignore that for the moment. What RSpec does is, as part of its assertion methods, is to effectively provide some form of almost written English to help you validate against something. Now remember, Ruby is a little bit more fluent when it comes to actually writing code, in that it almost tries to express every line of code you write in some form of basic English. So here, what we're effectively saying is the title should be 16. And there are various variations of should we can use. For instance, for true or false values, we can do something along the lines of should be true, using the dot operator on some object. We can use various other operating values as well. For instance, we can do something along the lines of should be equal to or greater than, or is not equal to. There are various operators you can use here, but there is a slight problem with should, and now we can have a look at this deprecated warning. So let's run this again. Here, if you have a look, we're getting a deprecated warning. So what does deprecated mean? Deprecated is another way of saying something that is about to become obsolete, or is old, or won't be used going forward, or there are better ways to do what you've just done. That's effectively a round version of what deprecated means, or deprecation means. And what we're basically saying is, using should from RSpec expectations is effectively old, and the syntax is deprecated. Instead, it's advising us that we now use expect instead. So this quite nicely brings us on to expect. So what's expect? What's the difference between should and expect? Well, on a test level, there really isn't a strong difference between should and expect. It's just that expect will be implemented as the new form of assertion when writing RSpec tests, and expect are incredibly easy to write, and they also stand out as solid assertions, if you like. Now, there is a lot I can talk about the should, but in all honesty, there's no point, because it's about to be deprecated, or it is in fact deprecated already. So I don't want to spend too much of this video just talking about a method that won't be used, but at the same time, I think it's important you understand the historic value of where expect comes from, and it comes from almost an evolved version of the should. So let's have a go at using expect. So let's comment this out so we don't get this really pretty deprecated warning anymore, and instead this time we're going to say expect. And to write expect, all you do is you say expect, you then give whatever it is that you're expecting, whatever you're checking against. You then say to, and then you give whatever value you want to give. So in this case, I'm going to say expect total to be 15. So let's run this really quickly. So here, notice that the warning has gone because we're not using should anymore. But for the expect, we actually got a pass. We know it's a 15 because it printed out a 15. There are various variations of expect as well. So before we go any forward, you can use all the other operators, greater than or equal to, not equal to, less than or equal to, and so on. You can also use built-in methods. For example, you can say equal, EQ standing for equal. You can also say, or rather you can also provide the full name, i.e. equal. So let's run this really quickly. What we'll do is we'll put in a failure as well to see what the failures look like. So here, same thing, we expected something to be 16, instead got a 15, compared using the double equal sign and with a link to the error. Let's change that back. So what we'll do is let's write a really basic WebDriver test to use and expect, just to show you how it works in the real world, if you like. So let's get rid of that. So what we'll do is we'll quickly write a basic test. So Selenium WebDriver, and let's just write it really quickly before. So what we're going to do is quite simply say, well, let's make a brand new driver object, and we're going to say Selenium WebDriver for Firefox, and let's driver navigate to and let's not write an after method for the moment. All we're going to do is just say driver we're just going to print out the title at that point in time, and let's just make sure this works first. Oh, maybe I should spell this properly first. Alright. Okay. And the link I got back was this, so again let's just copy this and let's write some expecs around this. So expect well, to be okay. So that's an expect. So let's run this just to make sure that works. Okay, let's close that. So again we got it passed, and let's change it as well. So let's say homey instead. Again, run this. And this time we got a failure. So again we said we expected our test to be with a value of that, but instead got this back. So this is effectively how we write expects for our test. We can quite easily change this to a should if we want. So if we want, we can just say title should be that. Again, if we quickly run this, we will get a deprecated warning because we're using should. Okay. So we got the, well, we provided the wrong value, so it still did fail, which is good. But we also got the warning as well, because we should be moving away from using should. If on the off chance you don't get a deprecated warning, that's probably because you're using a slightly older version of Ruby. So if you followed the very first video of this video series where we installed Ruby, there's a good chance you will get this because you would have the most recent version of Ruby and RSpec running on your machine. But anyway, now we've actually seen this should and expect at work for our tests. And usually for your test, you don't need, when using should and expect, there's not a lot that you would need to use should and expect for. There's not a lot of detail you need to dig into, because you would most likely define exactly what is that you want to test against using this kind of approach where you've kind of already grabbed the detail. You then use a should and moving forward and expect to actually validate against those values with an actual value and an expected value. And one of the reasons why we've moved to expect, well, one of the reasons why expect was introduced and should was removed was so that expect almost stands out much more boldly as some kind of assertion, or a should isn't necessarily, because if you think about it, whenever you do a should, you follow it, you prefix it, whatever you're testing on. But with the expect, it stands out much more boldly that you're expecting something to happen, as opposed to looking through some kind of for loop or clicking on something and so on. So in this video, the first thing we did was we started by looking at should and expect. We looked at should as being a deprecated assertion mechanism, and expect being the new boy on the block, if you like. We also then looked at moving, or rather using should and expect for an actual test, a really basic test I might add, but we did look at use it for a test, and we also looked at it from a failure perspective as well, to see what failures look like when something fails. This video wasn't supposed to be really long-winded or really complicated, because should and expect, well, assertions in general shouldn't be too complicated to understand. The mechanics of these assertions are quite simply, you want to test the validation of something, and you've got an actual method and an expected method, and we've done that. One thing I'd like to add is, for any given test, especially when writing multiple different tests, one advice I'd like to give is, try your absolute best to limit the number of expects, or to limit the number of checks you write for any given test. So in this test, we've written two different checks which pretty much do the same thing, where one is using a deprecated API while the other one is using the brand new one. But try and limit yourself to the number of checks you do for any given test, simply because if your test fails and if you only have, let's just say, maybe one or a couple of assertions, or you have multiple assertions but they're all testing variations of the very same thing, then you know why your test failed. If, on the other hand, you have a test method which has 5-6 different checks, all checking completely different things on different pages, if it fails, without looking at the test and digging down into the test, you'd have no idea why it failed. Getting a message like this isn't actually very helpful, in that it just says you expected something and you got something, but it doesn't really say exactly what it is that it failed. For instance, it doesn't say here that the check on the title failed. So that is somewhat of a downfall. So to effectively help you better manage the errors you get back, which you should be able to mask from the name of a test. Again, this test method wasn't named very appropriately, but if you actually name your test methods appropriately, and have checks in your test method which are appropriate to your test method, if your test method fails, you'd know why it failed, or at the very least you'd have a much better understanding, an assumption as to why it failed. And that's it for this video, folks. If you enjoy my videos and find they bring you some new knowledge or insight into writing WebDriver RSpec tests, then please subscribe and rate. If you have any questions or video suggestions, then please leave a comment below. Many thanks for watching. Until next time, ciao.